I hope you can see my screen now. Today we're going to discuss about SQL Server security and how we can protect our SQL servers and how usually we grant access to the databases for the users. And before I kick off this session, do you have any questions about the last topic which we have discussed, the database objects? Yep, that's good. And I hope you have practiced a bit on this last weekend. Okay, all right. Let me start today's session. We are already too late, so it is very important to understand the SQL Server security. And usually we get a request from the users and the application teams requesting access for the databases in UAT and in production. And first of all, I would like to give you an overview how usually we work in real time. When we get a request from any user or any application team asking for access on a production server, we should not give the access straight away. There is a certain policies we need to follow. It's like we need to understand what's the business reason the user is expecting the read or write access on the database, why he need it, and if he justifies the reason, then he might need to get an approval from his line manager or business manager, and then after we need to get an approval from the application owner for which the user is expecting the access. So once we get all these approvals, then only we will grant the permissions to the users. And again, it has to be in a process that the user has to raise a change request, and that has to go through all the approvals, then only the DBA will grant the permissions. The security best practices. So what are the best practices we can follow to secure our databases? The first is make security a part of your standard process. So you have to make yourself a standard process to work on the access request. Having said that, usually all the time users come to us and ask and request the access, but we need to explain the process for them. We need to have certain standard process and that we request the user to follow. And the second is to use the principle of least privilege. Usually users always come to us and ask the full permissions on the database. Even though if they are just trying to read the data, they would expect us to provide the full permissions on the databases. So we need to control the access for the user. We need to ask certain questions to the users why he would need full access on the database, what type of tasks he would like to do on the databases. So we need to ask certain questions to the users so that we can understand what exactly the user is expecting to do on the databases. So based upon that, we need to only provide the permissions that are really required. If the user is required only read access on the database, then just restrict the permissions for read. Don't ever give him write permissions. And next is implement defense in depth. That is a layer security, and we usually call it as a Windows indication. Enable only required services and features. When we install the SQL Server, there are certain features, the server layer features will be disabled automatically. I will take you through those features. SQL itself keeps them disabled with the installation. If you really want to use those features in your business, then we need to go and enable those features. So unless you really don't need, so please keep them disabled. Regularly review security settings. That as a DBA, we need to regularly audit our security settings, like who all got permissions on what databases. Maybe in real time what happens is a user requests the read and write access now on a database because he would like to do some testing, and we after getting an all approvals, we grant permissions for the users. Maybe after a week, once he finish with his work, he never come back to say, I haven't seen any user coming back and saying that, oh, I am done with my work, please revoke my permissions. So usually user won't come back and say, please remove my permissions, because they are done with their work, they just leave that. So as a DBA, we need to review the securities every quarter at least. We need to check that who are all got permissions on the database, and we need to go them. We need to just shoot out an email to them that do they really now require the permissions? Are they still working on those databases? So by doing this, we can at least keep our databases restricted from unnecessary users. And educate users about the importance of security. Yes, it again relates to the same. Users obviously ask full permissions on all databases, so we need to educate them what it costs for the databases. And then define security roles on business rules. So we need to define what are the business requirements that can have the permissions on the databases. They need to have business reasons to get access on production databases. So SQL Server security, here we have got two types of layers. That is, the first one is the Windows authentication, and the second one is the mixed mode. Mixed mode is a combination of Windows authentication and as well as SQL Server authentication. If I select the authentication mode as Windows and install the SQL Server, then that particular instance will only allow Windows users to access the databases. It only allows Windows users to access the databases. So what if an application require a login that is not part of the domain? When I say domain, it's something like if you're working for any organization that has a domain name global, then your Windows ID would be something like global/ your name. So that is we call as a Windows account or domain account. So if you select Windows authentication for SQL, then you can only create Windows dedicated logins. So you can create logins for the one who have got a domain account. And the other one is a SQL Server authentication, is something you don't need to have a domain account. As I said, a application require a SQL authentication, maybe a login they required with a name called CRM_test. If that is the login name they would like to use, then we can create that login using SQL authentication. When you select mixed mode, it does allow Windows authentication and as well as SQL Server authentication. So if it is a SQL authentication, then you can create a SQL authenticated login with password. But for Windows authentication, you just create a login and you don't need to assign any permissions, because already it is a part of Active Directory in your organization, so that Windows authenticated user can use his own credentials. You don't need to specify, but for SQL authentication it is required. I will show you in a moment so that you can understand it better. But for now, for Windows authentication, passwords are not required. And for mixed authentication, that is for SQL authentication, username and passwords are required to log in. You can see here, this is a picture I have captured. This is a server and this is a database. And if any user want to access the database, maybe the user is trying to access through his machine, and that has to first get a network authentication to your organization. That is we usually call as a VPN. When we connect to any server, the first thing we need to have access to our organization intranet. Once we get into the intranet, then after you need operating system authentication that we call as a Windows authentication. So once the user pass this level, then that user need to have access on the database. So we usually grant access to the server and database, but this part it is under our control, but the user to get a network authentication is not in our control. This is authentication modes window. If you remember, when we are installing the SQL Server, at one point we have selected the authentication modes. There were two options to select. One is Windows authentication and the other is a mixed mode authentication. Maybe you are not sure about the authentication type, so you went with the default one, that is a Windows, with the installation. And upon the installation, you do have an option to change the authentication types. Probably while you are doing installation, you might not aware that you need to select SQL authentication, but still it's not a problem. Even of the installation, you can still change the authentication types by just right clicking on the instance, and you can go to onto properties. On properties on left hand side you see a security, and there immediately on the right side it gives the server authentication. So you can easily switch and swap the authentication types whenever you require. And coming to the security objects, we have two terms here, logins and users. Don't be confused, the terms uh, might the login and users, both terms look identical and gives the same meaning, but there is a huge difference in perspective of SQL. A login is something is used at instance level or server level. A login is used for authentication at instance level or at server level. A single instance might contain hundreds of databases, right? So a login is first required for any person to connect to a SQL instance. And once he got a login, then a user is required on each and every database for which he is looking for access. So login is at server level or instance level, and user is at database level. If a person having a login can connect to a SQL instance, but he cannot access a SQL databases. So he explicitly required a user on that database. So I hope I'm making it clear for you. Login is at instance level. So if you create a login for any person, he can connect to the instance. That doesn't mean he has access to all the databases. A login just gives an ability to connect to the SQL instance. If that person doesn't have a user on the database, then he cannot connect to the databases. So login is at instance level and user is at database level. And a login must be associated to a user in the database. So user resides in each and every database. Login is at instance level. So we need to associate this login with the user, then only the person can access to the database. Maybe by looking at theory it might make you a bit confused, but once we jump onto the demo it make you clear. You use the user account to control the activities performed in the database. If no user account exists in database for specific login, then that particular login can connect to SQL instance but cannot access any database. So if the login is not associated with any user in the database, then that login can connect to the instance but not to the SQL databases. And when a database is restored from one server to the other server, in our next to next classes we'll discuss about the backups and restores. Then you will be familiar how to perform the backups and restores. So for now I'm taking an example that you have two different servers and you are requested to do a database restore from server A onto server B. So you start taking a backup on server A for a database, and as user is part of a database, so that backup file does contain the user information. So you copy that backup file and you restore that backup on a server B. So once the database being restored on server B, the user does exist on the database, but we don't have a login on that. So in that situation, we call that user as orphan user. Orphan user is nothing but a user doesn't have a login. You can map something like login is a parent and user is a child. So we need to have association between these two. We need to have a mapping between these two. Then only the person or the user can access the database. So to make it clear, yes, Mani. We'll talk more about the backups and restores when we are in the topic of the backups and restore. I will take you through the steps of migrating all the things. But for now, let us try to understand more at the logins and users. So the login, what are the login we create on the instance, that login information will be stored in a table called syslogins inside the master database. So this is an interview question, so please concentrate here. Whenever you create a login on the SQL instance, that login information will be stored in syslogins table inside master database. And once you create a login, that will just give you an option to connect the SQL instance. And if you would like to connect to any database, then you have to create a user and map that login to the user. So the user, when a user created, it will be stored in sysusers table in user database. So each and every database does have a user information because users are at database level. If you have 100 databases and you granted permissions for 100 databases, then those 100 databases does have the user details. But for logins generally stored in a table called syslogins in master database. So I've got a SQL server here. I'm just showing a figure. I've got a user and he does have a login. So when a person, let me try to restrict myself of using these two words. So when a person has got a login on a server, then he can only connect to the instance but not the underlying databases. If he want to connect the underlying databases, then he should have a user inside those databases. So I've got in my SQL Server, I've got three databases, DB1, DB2 and DB3. So now a DB1 has a user for this person. Let's assume he is a John. He has got a login to connect to SQL instance, and then he has got a user inside the DB1. Then he can make a connection, or he can have access to the DB1. And on database 2, the user doesn't have a user. Sorry, the person, the John, doesn't have a user inside DB2. So in that case, this John cannot access the DB2 database. And then after, the John has a user mapped to this database, then he does have access on this database. So for SQL authentication, we usually provide the name and credentials. I will just take you through those two demos. The first is the first thing I would like to show you about the features, which I explained in the first slide, that we should not enable the features unless it is really required. So I will just show you those options where we can enable and disable. It's taking a long time to load. It seems the SQL services are not running at backend, so I need to find a way to open. SQL services are not running at backend, so that's the reason I can't connect to the database engine. So I'm just starting the SQL server and the agent. Yes, Venkat, I see your question. That's a very good question. You can see the startup mode still says automatic. So the SQL services should be coming online. They should come online when I start my machine, but unfortunately the SQL services were got failed to come online. So I need to check the event viewer and the other stuff, because before signing into the GoToMeeting just half an hour before, there was an issue with the GoToMeeting, so the console was not opening for me, so I have to forcefully reboot the server, wherein it took a lot of time. So I need to check at that side why the services were got failed. But it's a good observation, Venkat. So in order to create a login on a SQL server, as of now you can see I have got instance. Only me has got sysadmin rights on this instance, and none other have permissions on this instance to connect. So in order to create a login, you can see a security over here. Just expand the securities and then you see logins. In order to create a login, you need to right click on this login and do a new login. So before that, I need to show you the features that I was talking about in my first slide. So right click on the instance and then you see a facets. So select the facets. And here, if you click a drop down, the last option which says surface area configuration, just select it. And you can see these are the features that were automatically disabled. You can see the property was set as false. So they were installed, but they kept it as a default, sorry, disabled. So unless you really require those things on your business, then only come here and enable it, or else you can just keep them false. I can give an example here. You can see there's a feature called database mail enabled. From SQL Server, you can send emails to the distribution list. If you want to notify any of your users, or if you want to notify yourself in case of any backups fail or any other abnormalities on your server, then we configure database mail, and using that database mail profile, we send emails to the target list. So in order to set up a database mail profile on your instance, this property should be true, or else you cannot set up a database mail. And the other option and the other feature is XP_CMD shell. So this is, if you enable this property, then you can use an extended stored procedure within your SQL Server that can talk to your operating system. If you want to create any Excel file or any notepads, or if you want to rename the folder, if you want to drop a folder, if you want to freshly create a folder, or if you want to move the files between the drives, so these are operating system tasks. If you want to do those tasks by sitting in the SQL Management Studio, you need to use XP_CMD shell commands. That commands can only work if you enable this property. So there are even other properties that does exist, but what I mean to say is, If your business really require those commands to execute, then only come and make it as a true, or else please keep them disabled. So going back to the logins, if you expand the logins here, you can see there are already some pre-created logins. These are created with the SQL instance, and there's a one login which says SA. If you remember at the time of the installation, once we have selected mixed mode, immediately bottom to that, it has enabled two fields where we provided the passwords. That is for system administrative account. That is SA account. We usually call as SA account. So in order to create a new login, we right click on the logins and do a select new login. And this is where you have got two options. Do you want to create a Windows login or do you want to create a SQL login? As of now, I don't have any domain accounts, so I would select SQL login. So as soon as I select SQL login, I require to provide the passwords. So I create a sample login. Let's say maybe I'm creating a login with Venkat. Okay, as Venkat is not a is not a domain account. I'm just giving my own name. I can give a test login, I can give a sample, I can give any name I want. So that is for SQL authentication. But if it is a Windows authentication, then it has to be, the user have to be part of Active Directory. So as this is a SQL authentication, I need to provide the password for this login. So I can give any password I want. And then after, you see there are three fields that were automatically checked. The first one, enforce password policy. If this option being checked, that indicates you need to provide your password with certain policies. Like the password should be minimum 8 characters, and it should have alphanumeric with a special character with the one uppercase. So that is a policy. Generally we whenever we try to create any account on any portal, if you just give a simple four character, it does not accept. It will ask you to provide a password with minimum 8 characters with alphanumeric and with uppercase and with a special character. So there's the same way. If you select this one, we have to create something more complex. And the second one is the enforce password expiration. I hope you already been into this type of policies. If you are using a banking, net banking, you might usually get pop-ups or alerts to change your passwords for every 90 days or 180 days. The same for SQL Server. If this option been checked, the user's credentials the password has to be reset for every 180 days. And the next is the user must change the password at next login. It is because might be Venkat is asking me to create a login for him. He's not a Windows authentication user for the server, but when I create here, I provide my own password. So once I provide the username and password to Venkat, when he try to log in for the first time, the SQL Server will ask him to change the password, because the old password been provided by me and I know the credentials. So that is the reason the SQL Server will ask him to change the password for the first time when he logs in. And the next are that are not required for us to discuss more. They are into more security symmetric keys. So I just restrict myself here. So for now, I'm gonna uncheck this because I don't want to get that much complex in this session. So I just uncheck that so that it will accept me any passwords I give here, and it won't alert me to change the passwords and expiry dates. And then after, you can see the default database. So what does this mean is, whenever Venkat logins onto this instance, it automatically takes his connection to master database. Even though he doesn't have full permissions on the database, it will just give a mapping to master database. And then after, on left hand side, you see server roles. Server roles are nothing but server wide permissions. These are server wide permissions. If I grant bulk admin permissions for this person, then he can run bulk commands, bulk insert commands. It's nothing but insert into select star into the BCP commands. And those BCP commands can be used to load some GBs of data from flat file onto SQL tables. So SQL Server does got some predefined bulk commands, and in order to execute those commands, the user has to be part of this server role, the bulk admin server role. And if a user is part of DB creator, as it names, the user has an ability to create new databases. If Venkat is part of this DB creator server role, then he can start creating his own databases on this instance. And the next is a disk admin. The member of disk admin can manage the drives on your server. And then after, the process admin, the member of this process admin fixed role can kill any of the processes that are running on the instance. So we usually kill any process if any of the tasks or if any of the tools that were hung on your machine, we go to the task manager and we select any of the application and then we do an end task. So not everyone can do that. So either the person should be a local administrator on the server or he has to be part of this process admin. And then after, this security admin. A member who is part of security admin can create logins and assign permissions for other. Let's say if I grant security admin for Venkat. So now onwards, Venkat can create logins for others. So that's the permissions he has got. And the next is a server admin. Server admin is somewhere he can do all the stuff within the server. And the next is a setup admin. If a member is a part of setup admin, then he can run the setup files. He can do some installation within the SQL Server. And last but not least is a sys admin. If a person is a member of the sys admin fixed role, then he can do anything within the server. He can run the bulk insert commands, he can create the databases, he can drop the databases, he can manage the data drives within the server, he can kill any processes, he can take backups, he can do restore, he can create logins, he can do all this stuff. Sysadmin is a supreme permissions in SQL Server. That is the reason usually we won't give anyone else this sysadmin permissions. It's the only for DBAs. Only DBAs will have sysadmin permissions on production. None other will have sysadmin permissions, even though he's a CIO or your reporting manager or any other superior. It's the only the DBAs will have permissions on this. That is the reason we are responsible for the databases. And we generally won't give any users the sysadmin role because they can do anything. They can drop the databases. They can change anything they want within the SQL instance. So we are not supposed to give sysadmin permissions on any production server. and I uncheck this is admin, and you do see a public which is checked by default. This public doesn't hold any information. By having a member of this public group doesn't give any permissions. It just gives a connectivity to the instance. Okay, so I'm not assigning any permissions here. Have just created a login and I click on OK. So now you can see a login Venkat is created. Now let me try to connect the SQL instance with the credentials of Venkat. So to make a new connection, you can click on connect and select database engine, and the other option is you can just click on this connect object explorer. So now here by default it was taking a Windows authentication. If it is a Windows authentication, I don't need to provide any username or password. It automatically takes the Windows name with which I have logged in into. So I have logged in into this machine with my name, with the computer name / with my name. So while logging into this machine, I have provided my password. So I don't need to again provide the password in order to connect to this instance. When I select Windows Authentication, it automatically inherits my password as well. But let me change it to SQL Authentication because I have created SQL Authenticate login. So when I change the SQL Authenticated login, I need to provide the username and password. So just provide the username followed with the password and click on connect. You can see it has connected successfully, but if you look the difference from the first to the second, if you look at properly, the SQL agent does exist with my first connection. This connection I have connected with my sysadmin permissions, okay? And this second connection I made with a user called Venkat, and he does not have any permissions. He just got a login and the SQL agent does not exist here. That indicates he doesn't have full permissions on the instance. And then after what I said, being a login doesn't give you permissions to access the databases. So let us try to access a sample DB, try to expand it, and it gives an error that the sample DB is not accessible. And the same thing if you do for HSBC or test DB, it doesn't give access because we just created a login, but we haven't created a user inside the databases. In order to access Venkat on all these databases, he should have a user on these databases. So for that, let me go on to my sysadmin credentials. Then after I go to the security and have Venkat, go to the properties and let me create a user. You don't need to create any scripts to, or sorry, you don't need to write any scripts to create a user. It's very easy and you can do it in fingertips. So hopefully we are a bit familiar with general and with server rules, and the next is the user mapping. So this is where we map the login to a specific database. So we have got the list of databases here. There's a question from Ishwar. That means developers will have SQL Server authentication and admin will have Windows authentication. No. In real time, all of your users, majority, I can say 98% of your users will be Windows authentication. Only 4 or 5% you might require to create a SQL authentication. The one who is a member of your organization, for them, you will be creating Windows authentication. Windows authentication and SQL authentication, they are two authentication modes. They won't decide what permissions you need to have. If you're a member of any organization, then obviously you will be having an email ID with an Active Directory account. Then if you ask for any database to get access, you will be created with a Windows authentication. Apart from that, even though you have a Windows login, if you still want a SQL authentication for your application to connect to the database, then you might request to create a SQL authenticated login. Ishwar, did I answer your question? Yeah. So this is the page where we decide to which database we grant access for Venkat. Okay. Let us try to provide access for sample DB for this person. So you can just do a check mark here. So before I do a check mark, we have got a column called user and then a default schema. So as soon as I do a check for sample DB, you can see under user, the name was picked up as Venkat. That means once I click OK here, this database will be created with a user. So before I create or map the user, let me cancel this. Okay. And let me go back and show you under sample DB. If you expand the sample DB and then go to securities, you have users. You can expand it here. Now you don't see Venkat. That is the reason it is not allowing you to connect. Although sysadmin, the person who has got sysadmins or at server level, they don't need a user. But this Venkat, we haven't granted him any server role permissions, right? And he doesn't have a user account within the databases. So let me expand and show you for HSBC, then security, and then users. No, he doesn't have an entry for Venkat. So that is the reason it is not allowing for Venkat to log in or to access this database. So once we create or once we map the login, then after you can see the user will be created. So go to properties, then user mappings. So I'm mapping Venkat to the database called sample DB, and then after the schema. Schema is nothing but once we create a login for this user, okay? And if this user creates any new tables in the database, what schema should it contain? So by default, we can give DBO as the schema. Venkat says that means we will create logins users in default instance. Yes, obviously we are the persons who create the logins and users for the one who are requesting for access. Maybe you will get some request like from a user. Let's say if I'm David, I will drop you an email and say, Venkat, can you please grant me a read and write access on a sample DB database on so and so instance. So as I'm a part of AD account, so what you can do is you can go to new login, and instead of SQL, as I'm part of your organization, then I should have an AD account. Then you would click on search and you would type my name here and then do a check names. So if I'm part of AD group, then it will automatically search in the Active Directory and it picks up the name. But I don't have David in my machine, so I have a user with RMVP. Okay, when I do a check names, it's something like is it SQL? No. Even though it should pick up automatically, but let me make it as a groups to check. So it should still work in real time even though you provide a first name of David. You don't know the second name. You're not sure about that. Then if you try to search with the first name, then it would list out all the persons whose first name is David in your organization. Then you need to pick up the right one. You can see here, this is called a Windows authentication. You can just click OK, and the login account would be something like the domain. This is a domain slash the username. So for this, you don't need to provide any passwords because the AD account has its own password. So you can just create Windows authentication this way. And having said that, most of the times you get requests from the users, and that users are already part of your Windows AD account. So you just need to browse and find their names and create the login. Very rare case you might get requests to create a secret authentications. So I'm going back here. So when we select the sample DB, a user automatically listed here, and then after whatever the roles you are seeing here, these are database roles. The one which we have seen at here, this place, these are server roles. That means these are server wide permissions. And under user mappings, we do have database level permissions. The first one is the DB access admin. If you provide a permissions for this access admin, then I do have a document for here. I can keep it open for you. Yeah. These are the database roles. So DB underscore access admin, the members of DB underscore access admin fixed role can add or remove access for other Windows logins. So if you provide a user with this access, with these permissions, then that user can change the permissions for other logins on the database, so other users on the database. And the next is a DB backup operator. Members of this DB backup operator can back up the database. So if I grant DB backup operator for Venkat, that means Venkat can back up this database. Venkat can back up the database called SampleDB. And if you grant permissions data reader, that indicates he can read the data. And the same way, if you grant DB underscore data writer, then he can write the data. That means he can manipulate, he can insert, he can update, he can delete the data in the tables. And then after DB underscore DDL admin, that is nothing but the data definition language. If a member is part of this role, then he can create new objects. He can create new tables. He can drop existing tables. He can alter the structure of tables. Then after DB underscore deny data reader, that indicates revoking the permissions of read, and DB underscore deny data writer, that's an opposite of data writer. So if you grant these permissions, then that particular user cannot write or cannot manipulate any data inside your database tables. And then after a DB owner. DB owner, a member who got DB owner, then he can do all these stuffs. He can back up the database, he can read the data, he can write the data, he can create new tables, he can drop existing tables, he can do all the things within the database. If you grant a user to be DB owner and sample DB, then he can do all the stuffs. He will be the owner of the database. He can do anything he wants within the database. He cannot jump onto test DB and do the stuff. His permissions are very much restricted to the sample DB, even though he got a full permissions on the database. And then after security admin, if a member is part of a security admin, then he can create new users on this database. So for now, what I do is I will just grant the permissions. Let's say, let me put you a question that uh, I would like to provide read access on sample DB for Venkat. So among all these listed roles, what role should I select? The user, I need to just grant read permissions. That's perfect. Mani and Kaushik. Yeah, Venkat, you too. Let me put you other question. Maybe the user would like to create new tables. He want to create new table on this database. So what permissions should I grant him? Mani, we don't have any rule saying DBA admin. Do you mean it's DDL admin? Yes, Mani, you are right. DDL admin is the right role. And Venkat and Ishwar, my question was, the user would like to create new tables. Data writer is something he can write or he can manipulate the data within the tables. If I provide data writer to any user, that user can only manipulate the data within existing tables. He cannot create new tables. If he want to create new tables, then he has to be part of DDL admin. So let me first restrict this user with the data reader so that I can show you how it really works. So I restricted this user with the data reader so he can only read the data. He should not write the data inside this database. So I click OK, and going back to the management studio. So here now you can expand the sample DB, and you can see here under users, now you can see Venkat. So as have got a user under database, so now it should allow the user Venkat to access the database. So this is the instance have connected with the credentials of Venkat. So let me refresh now, and I can expand the database called SampleDB. At first it was throwing out an error, but it allows me now to access the database. But what if I access HSBC? It still says I cannot access. Can you tell me what is the reason why can't I access the HSBC or the test DB? The answer is we have not mapped the user to HSBC or test DB. That means the HSBC database and test DB database doesn't have Venkat as a user. So I can open a new query with the credentials of Venkat. So in order to confirm with whose credentials this new query window is open. So how can you check? Where you look at to know and understand with whose credentials you open this management studio. So this is the place you look at. You can see here the first it indicates the machine name, that's the instance name, and then after it gives you using what credentials you have connected to this instance, and then after to which database this query is connected to. So now let me do a quick read. Does this table? Yeah, I do have some tables. So in order to read the data from the table, we write query called select star from tbl underscore test, and yeah, this table doesn't have any data, so you can still, it gives you an output saying that the query executed successfully even though this table doesn't have data. Yeah, so you have read permissions on this database, so on this database with all tables, but maybe unknowingly this user is trying to insert data in this table. If we try to execute a query that inserts a row in this table, so let me execute it, and it throws an error saying that the insert permission was denied. It clearly says you cannot insert values, you don't have permissions, you can just read the data. But the same thing I can do with my admin permissions. So I can open a new query window for this, and you can see here this is with my credentials. So this is the reason I'm always stressing you out to check on whose credentials you are running with. Now I have opened the two new query windows. So at some time you might get confused that for which instance for which query window. So you need to ensure by looking at bottom. So I change the database from master to sample, and I execute this query. So it successfully inserted a row. So I can go back to the Venkat user and I can do a select, and it gives me a result. So this particular user Venkat has got only read access. He cannot insert. Either he cannot drop the table. This is a command to drop the table. He cannot even drop the table. It clearly said that he doesn't have permissions. So let me give him a write permissions. I will do it quickly. Please bear with me another 5 or 10 minutes. I'll go back to the properties. You cannot change your permissions within your SQL instance. See, this is what you have connected with Venkat, and you cannot extend your permissions within yourself. If you want to change any permissions, again you need to go back to your instance for which you have connected with admin rights, and from there you will grant or revoke the permissions. So I'm going back to properties of login Venkat, and then go to user mappings and select the sample DB, and here it's a data reader. Then let me give him data write and then do quick OK. And now try to insert a value. This time your query should get succeed because you now have write permissions on this table. It's just a write permissions. That means you can either insert, update or delete the data inside a table, but still you cannot drop a database table. I see a question, why the agent services are disabled For Venkat, because Venkat doesn't have full permissions on this instance. He has just got a login and he got permissions on user databases. Only the one who has full permissions on this instance will able to see the agent services. And SQL agent are required to automate the jobs. So as a user, Venkat has got very restricted permissions, so that's the reason it was not displaying for him. So I cannot drop or create a table. It still throws me an error because this user has now only got a read and write permissions. He cannot drop a table. So in order to get this statement succeeded, this particular user should be part of db_ddl admin. So you can right click and go to properties, and again user mappings. Most of the times people often get confused over here. When they open the properties of any login and when they select user mappings, they forget to select the database, and they look at here and complain that all the roles were grayed out. You have to select it. Even though you select AdventureWorks or database, it throws out grayed out unless you do a click here. Then only the underlying rules will get enabled. So for sample DB, I give him a DDL admin so that he can drop this table now and do a fresh refresh. The table table_test1 is gone. So this is how we manage the permissions for the users. So when it is not required, then don't give him DDL admin or data writer. Let's say you got a request from a user asking read and write permissions. So if you grant him DDL admin, then there is a chance he might delete. Intentionally, no user will delete, but when they write queries to test something, and unfortunately if they execute everything in the window, then you end up losing all your tables. So to create a Windows authentication, let me finish off by creating a Windows login for you. To create a Windows login, the first thing is go to new login. Before that, let me create a new user account on this table, because Windows authentication can create for the one who are part of this machine. So as I don't have any domains, so I can create users on my laptop and I can add those users to the SQL to show you the Windows authentication. So let me create a user. I'm just creating a new user account on my machine. I don't want to create that here. So what I say is maybe a user John. Okay, so I have created a user account John. Now I can search for the John. So in the same way, in your real time, if you are asked to create any Windows login, you have to click on search and come over here and whatever you're seeing here from this location, it will be your uh, computer name or your server name. And under that, if you click on locations, under in real time, I'm just saying in real time, you will find a plus button here. If you can expand, you will see entire website or entire directory from where you can search that user. So it should still work even though when you come onto this page, you can type your uh, maybe the user name to whom you want to grant the access, and just click on check names so that it can find that name in the active directory and it will list out. So then do click OK. And having said that, the Windows indication doesn't need any passwords, so you can directly jump onto server roles or user roles and grant the permissions appropriately. Maybe this user, we can grant him on testDB with a permission called data reader or data writer, and then just click OK. And before I click OK, we do have other things, securables, which is something you can do at object level. What are the permissions we have given now for Venkat, the read permissions? He can read all the databases in the all the tables in the database. Let's assume I have 10 tables in a database, and when I provide a DB underscore data reader for any user, that user can access all the 10 tables. But the business requirement is that particular user should not access one among those 10 tables. One table is very sensitive and that user should not access that. So in that case, you can grant the permissions at object level. So you can come over here and you can select the object types and you can choose the appropriate table. The other way of doing that is go to the database and then go to the user, and here you can do the same thing. Search specific objects, sorry, all objects of the types, and then you can select tables for what object you want to grant permissions and then do and here as of now I've got only one table, so it listed out. So at the bottom, what permissions you want? Do you want to grant him select permissions or delete permissions? You can do whatever stuff you want within that object. So any questions? That's it from my side for today. And I request everyone to please create some test logins on your machine. Maybe the same way you can pick it up, like just assume user is requesting you for a read access. Try to provide read access and then come back and try to log in with those user credentials and check whether that user has just got the read permissions. And when he try to execute any write, data writes or inserts any or deletes, it should throw out an error. Just make yourself compatible by doing some exercises. Venkat, I don't understand your question. All permissions, login, etc. named instances, no. Named instance is completely different. If you have full, even though you have sysadmin rights on default instance, it doesn't give you an option to connect the named instance. It's completely different. The named instance is completely different. The default instance is completely different. It is just because we don't have multiple machines here. We don't have multiple servers here. That's the reason we are creating two different instances, the default and named instances on one single machine. If you're a sysadmin on the default instance, you cannot connect to the named instance. You have to be a login within the named instance. Okay, I see a question from Navnita. Can you show the new user by Windows indication? Have just created, it seems. Okay, I've cancelled it seems. Okay, to create a Windows indication, we just search that user in our domain and then go to server roles, and I map this user for database HSBC and provide him a data reader, then click OK. So now you can see a login was created for the user, and you can easily identify what is Windows login and what is SQL login. Windows login would be something like your domain slash your username, and SQL login will be directly a name. So in order to connect, the first thing I need to log off from my credentials, from Vishu credential, and then I need to log in into this machine with John credentials. Then only I can make his connection. I hope you understand. I need to log off my session and I need to RDP, or I need to log in into this machine with John. Then only I can make a connection to this instance. That is how it works in really. The user, whenever I provide permissions to the user, he will log in from his machine, right? So he can make easily connection. He can make a connection to the SQL instance. I see a question from Ishwar. Does Management Studio will keep on running all the time 24/7 on DBA machine? Yes, that is a tool we usually use to interact with the databases. We use the Management Studio all the time to talk with the databases. So any more questions before I close the call? And having said that, please try to create some logins and with some permissions, and if you encounter any issues, please drop me an email and we'll work it out. Thank you guys, thank you very much, and apologize once again for delay in today's class. Thank you and have a great day.